Alright, so in this video we're going to talk about the chapbook, The Lawless River, by my friend Shaun Turner. Try to angle this so you can see it. Alright, so Shaun is one of contemporary Kentucky's emerging star writers, in my opinion at least. I actually don't know that much about Kentucky literature as such, but Shaun is a fiction writer who I think also does poetry, or at least he runs a poetry journal, Fire Poetry, and he's definitely a sort of emerging voice to watch on the scene if you're interested in Kentucky literature, Appalachian literature, Southern literature, any of this stuff. So the Lawless River is a fairly short chapbook, a set of short stories. I think it's really, really interesting because it does a lot of the kinds of things that you often see with contemporary Appalachian literature, which is it takes these sort of ideas or themes that are very traditional in Southern literature, Appalachian literature, things like the relationship to place, to Appalachia, the mountains, rivers, hollers, etc. It takes family relationships. It takes social roles, the cohesion of communities. It takes these very traditional themes for Appalachian and Southern literature, and it complicates them. It points to contradictions and problems and ways in which these things actually kind of work against the people of the region, the people who are most directly affected by these traditions. So I want to read you one of the stories, which is a fairly short one. A lot of them are fairly short. There's a couple of longer ones. I actually think the best story in this short collection is the title story, The Lawless River, but it's relatively long, so I'm not going to read it all to you. But I will talk about it in a little bit. But I like this story mid-construction, because I think it deals with a lot of these issues, and it sort of shows us how the theme of something like connections with nature, the interactions with the natural world, with the environment, can be troubled. Again, this is a big thing. This is a big traditional thing in Appalachian writing. The importance of nature, rural life, farming communities, gathering wild edibles, whether that's things like berries, roots, whatever, herbs, whatever it is. And so I think we start to get a sense of this here, as well as this sort of troubling of what family life means, because family is traditionally quite an important thematic focus of Appalachian literature. So this is mid-construction. When we saw the bear, I had already finished building the house, and Deb and I were having a bit of a rough patch. We decided to take a break from the mess of construction, the noises and dramas of living in a house in progress, and headed out to Piney Lake, a beautiful East Kentucky holler dammed up and flooded sometime in the early 1950s. I hitched our white camper shell to the pickup. Deb filled a cooler with beer and snacks. I rolled up our warm quilt, our biggest sleeping bag. It was mid-autumn, and Deb rubbed my forearm as we drove out to the lake, the golden sun still warm enough at day to camp outside at night. I parked next to the water, a campsite we rented with its blue porta-john, its dirty charcoal grill, and a concrete slab. I set out the quilt and sleeping bag, a vestige from my scouting days, and before my wife and I fell asleep, we lazed there silently and watched the water. Usually we saw neighborhood animals, the kind of small birds, a nervous feral cat, 5 distinct squirrels, a duck serene on the water. We saw the bear early the next morning, rustling through the garbage can. There was no food there, just leaves from the slab, bits of tree limbs. His matted head and bulky torso were lost inside the plastic bin, but his stout, furry legs led to wide paws. We knew he had claws big enough to maim. Fortunately, my wife brought her smartphone to the campsite. She quickly Googled how to get rid of a bear and pulled up a page that suggested 90% of a bear's diet was purely vegetation. That's not helpful, I whispered. I could feel her body tense in the sleeping bag. Well, is it a black or grizzly? I didn't know. I assumed that we were in black bear country, that grizzlies were back west. We just moved to eastern Tennessee from Colorado so Deb could go back to school. I would try to find an accounting job in Knoxville. Jim, the bear, she turned to face me, and I could see the worry lines creasing her forehead. If it's a black bear, Google says we can throw stones at it. The website says we could try yelling at him or banging pots and pans together, but instead we just laid on our stomachs and watched him tip one can over and move on to the next. There's something to admire about the black bear. Unlike the more savage grizzly, it has a natural curiosity matched with brute strength. And I thought about Deb bundled next to me, trembling like a small bird. Deb, the house we were building miles away, where some nights we didn't even speak to each other. So again, I think this is a great story. This would be what we in the business call flash fiction, and a lot of these are flash fiction, which is very, very short stories that develop themes and ideas very, very quickly. So one of the things, again, we see about this is that nature continually recurs in this story. This is an East Kentucky holler that was flooded sometime in the 50s. We have the Golden Sun. We have parking next to the water, watching the water. We have the small birds, feral cat, 5 distinct squirrels, a duck, and then obviously the latter half of this very, very short piece is focused on the bear. So nature is pervasive here. And again, that's a very, very common theme in Appalachian literature. But whereas in a lot of Appalachian literature and Southern literature, nature is home in some way. Nature is... So I don't want to oversimplify this, because often in Appalachian literature and Southern literature, nature is a sort of two-edged sword, because nature is a place in which the speakers of literature, the protagonists of literature, tend to feel very comfortable. They tend to feel... the nature tends to be a familiar surrounding for a lot of these speakers. Not necessarily the authors, but the speakers at the very least. At the same time, nature does tend to pose a threat, because nature obviously is dangerous. I mean, you may have any matter of natural disasters, accidents, things like this. Rock slides in the mountains, floods, mine collapses, which is sort of nature, sort of industrial, but definitely a big component of Appalachian life. Out in the woods, any number of accidents one might encounter. So there is always a complexity to it, but I think that one of the things we see more in contemporary Appalachian writers is an increased focus on that duality, the simultaneous sort of nature is comforting and nostalgic and home, and also nature is a threat. Nature is in some ways unknowable, even exceeds our sort of ability to understand and control. The fact that they don't know what kind of bear this is and how to respond to its presence, I think is really sort of indicative of that thematic interest in nature as a mysterious force that does not operate according to human rationality, that doesn't move along the same lines that the human mind works. Nature does not make sense of itself in the way that we make sense of ourselves, and this sort of stuff. I actually think this is where the Lawless River is really, really interesting. The title story, the collection as a whole, yes, but the title story as well, the Lawless River. Again, it's a much longer one. It is, I think, the longest story in this collection, with the possible exception of. Let me go to the table of contents so I can get the title right. Everything Blooms. That's another fairly lengthy one. But I think The Lawless River is actually my favorite of the stories in this collection. Basically, it tells the story of this town, Franklin Hollow, which is sort of flooded out by the Rockcastle River. This is in Kentucky, again, where Shaun is from. So Franklin Hollow is flooded out by the Rockcastle River, and there's this weird dynamic between the townspeople and the floodwaters, the townspeople and the river. Yes, it's this natural disaster that fills their homes with water and stuff like this, and sweeps away a lot of their properties. But initially, they're also now we've got a lot of fish. We can catch these smallmouth bass. And what he says here is, smallmouth bass overwhelmed the river for days. The worms began to uncork from the earth, and they migrated like lemmings to the asphalt. We picked the worms that struggled toward the road, put them into coffee tins, and took up fishing. The bass we caught were small and muddy, their mouths pursed like an old man's. The ones we didn't return to the water were deep-fried and eaten at cookouts and family suppers. The old men would tear the bright orange mass of eggs from their bellies and scoop them into their mouths. Fresh caviar. But then people start getting swept away by the raging floodwaters, and so the inhabitants of this town turn against the river, and they start throwing their garbage into the river as this sort of perverse attempt to take revenge on the waters. But the waters just sort of swirl the garbage around their town. So now it's not only flooded, it's flooded with garbage water. And so you've got this sort of weird dynamic back and forth where almost it runs like a feud between the townspeople and the river. And again, this is one of those interesting elements, this interesting change to how contemporary Appalachian writers approach nature and the natural world, which is, again, much more, I don't want to say cynical, but cynical is in some ways right. It's much more aware of and willing to address nature as threat, nature as sort of unpredictable force, unknowable, uncontrollable force in some ways. It's an emerging approach that we see in a lot of modern Appalachian writers, and I think The Lawless River gives us a really, really good example of this in a very short, very accessible package.